Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to GeekWatch, a subsidiary of the monastery, the open bar of the internet. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me is my good brother here in the temple, the man of 1,000 runes, the CEO of Zadari Enterprises, and the bane of my fucking existence, good brother Xanatrix.
Zadari Enterprises would like to remind you that the black pill can affect anyone and is a bad look for everyone. Please make sure to do all your research and play any demos you may have access to before you decide looking at someone else's footage of a game that the gameplay is shit. Do not rely on just one stream of footage. Look at multiple. Look at people who are streaming the footage for fun, people who are playing it for the challenge, and, of course, the people who go absolutely batshit insane and basically tear the game apart from inside out. It will give you a much better idea and understanding of what that game can be. Yes, this is a call out at anyone who espouses to want good video games and then is immediately shitting on the Stellar Blade demo because they watched one stream and decided, oh, the gameplay looks like shit. Fuck off. Miss me with that gay shit.
Yeah, if we're going to be getting on journalists for having bad takes when it comes to not just role playing games, what am I saying? Just games in general, we can't stoop to the same level of laziness. If we're going to call the IGNs and Kotakus of the world lazy slacktivists, we can't have that same level of sloth. But for this one, this particular topic arose from me looking back at some of the early episodes of GeekWatch and exploring what ideas we could visit. And given a certain failure of a TTRPG that I covered some time ago, you know, the one where we did a 180 about liking it and then being disappointed in the span of a month.
Yeah, but that wasn't the fault of the developers. It was the fault of the people overseeing the developers. Mana Project Studio, we still dislike all those changes.
Yeah. I am, of course, referring to the Cowboy Bebop role-playing game. One that originally I was giving the middle finger to some people because they thought it was going to be jumping on the 5e bandwagon solely because that's the bulk of Mana Project's catalog, even though I explained Mana Project was only publishing. It was a three-way thing between Fumble GDR, who I'm still on good terms with.
Don't Panic Hex's system.
Yeah, Don't Panic Games, who mostly does board games, so you haven't seen me talk about them all that much. And Mana Project Studio, who does do a whole lot of distribution of Italian projects. They're not the biggest distributor in that front. In fact, I'd say Two Little Mice has a much bigger track record, especially these days. By the way, folks, go take if you want a fascinating bit of dark fantasy, go look at Memento Mori. That should be out by now, if not being close to it. The backers already got their digital versions, which namely includes me.
Yep. But what we knew was that later on, from some very PR-friendly statements, I guess is the best way to put it. Would you agree, Monk?
Yeah, I can go with that.
Yeah, some PR-friendly statements by Fumble to the Monk. We learned that internally there were much more shenanigans than previous, and the system that we had originally looked at, that Fumble was very proud of, and rightly so, had been muddled to completely missing the point.
Now,
the only real resemblance to the original product that we saw was that it was still using a modified version of the Hexes system.
Yeah, and in all fairness, let me give the timeline from my perspective. So the Hexes system I have reviewed twice in my
Mm-hmm.
reviews of both Not the End and Knights of the Round Academy. Now the latter does use a modified version since it uses dice instead of stones. Not the End, which actually won an award in its native Italy for best TTRPG of that year, is a
Very
game that's
cool.
all about taking risks and is one of the better narrativist affairs. And one of the key things about it is not using stats in the traditional sense. It's using descriptive tags within its system. Put a pin in this because this is going to be important. So when I caught wind about the Cowboy Bebop RPG, because every pundit and every armchair wannabe expert who thinks that they know a few things was talking about it, um, when I found it didn't take long before I figured out that they were going to be involved, and I even ended my review of the Knights of the Round Academy stating that they were the right that Fumble GDR were the right people to handle a Cowboy Bebop RPG, because their first game was Gatai, which was their own send up to the super robot era of the 1970s. They specifically cited Go Lion and Voltez as chief inspirations for that project. They're planning on doing I don't know if it's out by now, but they were planning on doing a remake of it called Shin Gatai.
And for anyone who wonders, who doesn't know enough Japanese or doesn't know enough about mecha, the reason they specifically cite Go Lion and Voltez for this is Gattai means to combine, and so it's primarily the combiner mechs of the 70s.
Yeah. I don't know how well that game works because it never got translated. Another project that's untranslated that they were developing around the time of Knights of the Round was Login, which was their own tribute to Digimon.
So, as you can see from the types of games and the types of inspirations they take, anime is a big part of Fumble. At least some really classic anime too. So,
And when I've talked with the guys at Fumble, Knights of the Round Academy's biggest inspirations were um, were Gundam and Sailor Moon, and they wanted to combine the idea of giant robots with school drama.
so they just wanted to create Candidate for Goddess, but good. Got
Yeah,
it. I loved Candidate for Goddess as a guilty pleasure, but dear God, they could have done so much more with it.
we can't hate Candace for Goddess as much as Adult Swim hated it.
I don't know. I don't know. I can certainly try.
They spent years taking pot shots at the fact that they aired it.
I know. I know. But
But getting back on the rails, when I found out that the Cowboy Bebop RPG was happening, and then I put two and two together as far as who did it instead of just assuming like some people. Um, I had reached out to the guys, specifically specifically Claudio Serena, who I've had on the show on multiple occasions. Is a good guy. He was the guy who helped me out with the Latin for Agito Arcanum.
nice.
Uh,
I remember that. I'm going to look at the audience right now just for 1 second. I assume at this point Monk does not need to make the disclaimers about, financially supporting and hosting these guys.
mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
keep it in your pipe hole.
Mm-hmm. But originally, because I did want to do an interview with him regarding the Bebop RPG. The original thing that I heard was we would need to get the go ahead from the powers that be, namely Sunrise and Don't Panic. I was like, oh, okay, if that's what needs to happen, then let me know. Then I'm cool with that. Just do what you got to do.
Yep.
I didn't hear much on it for a little while. Then I reached up to follow up, and I get the remark that he had asked to be divested from the project.
Yeah.
Him and his team. Then around the same time, there was a comment on our initial Valley of the Judged episode on the Quick Start, where we were told that there was an updated version that had come out, and this was a few days before the Kickstarter was about to wrap up for the project. And I had looked it over, and I think I shared it with you, and
You did.
I was not happy with the direction that things were going. I was very
Yeah.
much not happy.
We both. For anyone who's watched that particular Valley one shot, you know that we lauded the fact that the system was not only building on a jazz session, an improv jazz session, and how that caused things to naturally escalate within whatever series of events you were doing as part of that. But it also was a really good sandbox. You weren't, once again, we have to stress this because we like sandboxes more than we like theme park type TTRPGs, because it allows us to create our own stories instead of being beholden to playing as Spike, Faye, Ed, or Jet. This allowed you to create your own bounty hunters with their own, dark histories if you wanted to, and their own trauma to deal with. You could create characters within the themes of Cowboy Bebop without having to play the cast of Cowboy Bebop, which was important to us. And while there are still elements of that available in what was changed, it didn't cohesively fit together anymore.
Yeah,
I think it's the big one.
I had such a reaction to it that I canceled my pledge on the Kickstarter, and then I put out that quick video just taking back my support of the project, because it was clear to me that the direction that it was going in just didn't work. And I did inform Claudio of that, and there was some back and forth where I can't get into full details because obviously there's only so much of the story that I'm going to be able to have. But the vibe that I ended up getting was that there was friction between Mana Project and Fumble GDR, specifically on the fact that Mana Project, I don't think they quite understood what the Hexis system is, because they were insisting on putting in numerical statistics in some form, or putting in approaches or the like, and all of those things are completely missing the point of the Hexis system.
Yeah. To give an example of how much Monk has talked about this, along with me, we did the Valley for the playtest documents.
Mm-hmm.
May of 2022. It's been almost 2 years at this point. And then right after that, at around November of 2022, when, as Monk was saying, the Kickstarter was about to wind down, he made his musing number 28, taking back his endorsement of the project.
Mm-hmm.
And then even later, last year, around September of last year, in fact, he even had a second musing about the disunderstanding in Cowboy Bebop's TTRPG.
Yeah, and that was because there were a few remarks in it that were so completely wrong, to the point where I can't elaborate how wrong they were, that I just had to get on it. And when I told John about some of it, he wanted to get in on it.
Yep. Ultimately, the misunderstanding was they didn't even understand what the target audience was, or what the target genres were.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and my one comment on this musing was the best way to classify Cowboy Bebop is as a sci-fi pastiche because it has so many different influences from all around sci-fi.
They this is something that I may do a future video on this down the road, but something that I've begun to notice among certain crowds is people wanting to do TTRPGs or the like that are based on given anime, manga, or Japanese video games without fully understanding the culture. And I'm not trying to say that you have to be in the culture in order to understand it. This isn't me pulling the full Asians represent podcast shit. Where they decided to shame L5R about the term shugenja, which I'm not letting that shit go. But a lot but we've talked about how some of the concepts of genre lines is something that isn't really present in a lot of popular media that comes out of East Asia in general and Japan specifically. And that's something that you have to learn if you're going to be making something that's based on those kind of properties. You can't have it. We talked earlier this month about how you can't have that whole fighter mage divide if you're making a wuxia game because that line doesn't exist in the same way. And the better wuxia TTRPGs fully understand this.
Mm-hmm.
In the same vein, the there was a portion where they talked about inspirations and recommended material, and some of the names that they brought in were baffling. Uh, I suppose like the fact that they invoked cyberpunk.
Which let's be fair here. While there are many science fiction inspirations for Cowboy Bebop, cyberpunk is not one of them. This is
And I'd like to read off one excerpt from page 114 of the book that just highlighted this particular problem. Where it's a excerpt called "Living on the Edge," where it goes into the dynamism of bounty hunter life, yada yada yada. Then says, "Is this cyberpunk? As a game group playing Cowboy Bebop, you might actually ask yourself this complex question. The next few pages can help you gain some clarity on the topics covered in Cowboy Bebop, and thus help you give it your all at the table when you set up your game campaign or one-shot session. This is a difficult question to answer with a simple yes or no. Cowboy Bebop is a very specific kind of cyberpunk, one that mixes a subgenre with other equally hybrid subgenres. The idea of a solar system is that it is alive and vibrant as it is complicated in layering of powers and conflicts, as it is reminiscent of one of the pivotal hooks of the cyberpunk genre, Bruce Sterling's schematrix. But Cowboy Bebop widely diverges from Sterling's approach to storytelling, using tropes and themes from the space western genre. They they even try and evoke the whole cyber psycho concept that's in the cyberpunk games from Pondsmith.
but there isn't anything like that in Bebop. People go crazy for different reasons.
And I know somebody might try and evoke Tong Pu, but he didn't go crazy because of cybernetics. He went crazy because a experiment to try and make a forced psychic caused mental regression.
Yep.
Plus, even before that, he was already a few eggs short of a picnic because he was an assassin.
Yeah.
But later on in the book, when it talks about further media, these are the entries that they list, and prepare for cringe. And if you saw my musing where I talked about disunderstanding, these will be familiar because I used this same thing, and I know Notepad had a field day with this as well. So further media: Akira, Battle Angel Adela, Borderlands, Cyberpunk Edge Runners. This game came out in 2022. The Expanse, Ghost in the Shell, specifically the 95 animated movie, Johnny Mnemonic, Neon City Overdrive, Nirvana by Gabriel Salvatores, The Outer Worlds, and Strange Day. Well, Strange Days, I should say, the 95 movie.
Mm-hmm.
Like, some of these I can kind of get, but there's ones in there that are just baffling. Now, obviously, I know this is a running gag by this point, but I still haven't seen The Expanse, so I can't comment on that. But do you remember when I said that I felt like Exalted Essence invoking Demon Slayer was more likely due to Demon Slayer being a popular anime around that time?
Yes.
That's the vibe I get with them evoking Cyberpunk Edge Runners, which they didn't. Which somebody forgot the S when they wrote it in there.
Yeah. The thing I got is mention popular thing for better SEO. That's what I got from it.
Um, Notepad had said something similar, though he was a little bit more cynical about it because he's more cynical than me.
I think he's more cynical than both of us, Monk.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, the vibe I got is mention current popular thing because that's what everybody's got eyes on.
Yeah.
I mean, is that a cynical statement? Yes. Is it probably also a true one? Probably.
Mm-hmm. And I should note that they try to give the there's a couple other major problems that are worth noting. I know one might say, well, what if it's trying to be averse to stats? It's not using stats. It has the grooves. Except the grooves are essentially 5 different approaches, each with associated tags within them. That is a stat in the traditional sense by any other name. Not to mention, segmenting the tags is kind of defeating the purpose of tags to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
The idea with the tags is you need to evoke them in order to get a reasonable bonus but it can have consequences if things backfire, since Not the End, the Hexa system, and subsequently this are all about taking risks. You cannot reasonably succeed without taking risks.
Yeah.
In addition, it also applies to how damage works, because if you get hurt, you don't lose HP or something. You mark off one of your tags.
Yep. One of your hexes gets closed.
Mm-hmm. The idea being, the tags are supposed to be something with significantly broader application than the equivalent of a skill or an approach. Like there was one of the other things to note, and I noted this in some of the musings, is there's a lot of in that place test that we covered.
Yep.
There was a lot of emphasis on a controlled chaos through jazz.
Yeah.
Like an understanding that that's part of the reason where the term bebop comes from, where the term sessions, which was used in the anime for the episodes, comes from, and so on.
Yeah. They mentioned that everybody's got to come together in this improvisational harmony, essentially, just like a jazz improv session. in order for things to at least succeed.
Because I would honestly say if there's any major theme to go by when it comes to Bebop as a whole, it is countercultures. Countercultures as a whole. And to illustrate that, I'd like to read one little blurb that was at the back of every single DVD during the original DVD run, which I still have.
Mm.
Jazz Agers, Flower Children, Lost Generation, Beatniks, Rockers, Punks, Nerds, Hackers, Lovers, Generation X, whatever the designation, there have always been outlaws in our society who live in pursuit of autonomy. At times they are revered for their roles as pioneers, challenging the unknown. Other times people consider them lawless desperados and a dangerous presence. Yet really, it is only their exuberant music and an autonomy founded to express opinions different from those of others that set them apart from the rest of society. The year 2071 AD, that future is now. Driven out of their terrestrial Eden, humanity chose the stars as their final frontier. With the section by section of collapse of the former nation, a mixed jumble of races and peoples came. They spread to the stars, taking with them the now confused concepts of freedom, violence, illegality, and love, where new rules and a new generation of outlaws came into being. People referred to them as cowboy bebops.
Yeah. And now I can already hear some naysayers who are looking to hoist us by our own petard coming up. Well, that certainly sounds punk, and so why isn't cyberpunk valid? Well, first of all, not all punk is cyberpunk, and second of all, not all counterculture is punk either. So, trying to paint with broad strokes, not gonna fly.
The only time you can get away with paint with broad strokes is if you're doing some Jackson Pollock shit. And this is not Jackson Pollock shit.
Or if you're just trying to paint a wall a single color. Broad strokes works there.
Mm-hmm. I mean, for that you use a roller.
Yup. That's a very broad stroke.
Yeah.
But regardless, the idea of harmony between these disparate countercultures was the entire was part of the influence within Cowboy Bebop as an anime, and all because Spike, Jet, and Faye alone are from three entirely separate cultures, and they're forced to work together. And then, of course, Ed comes in, and Ed's from another entirely different culture. And the people they get involved with are from entirely different cultures. But these cultures at least overlap a little. And when they come together to work together, marvelous things happen. And that was the entire focus of that playtest that we saw. That whatever disparate elements your bounty hunters had, whatever their own personal, world and their own personal culture was, the whole point was everybody needed to work together to get through the bounty.
And I know some may argue that the concept of high-tech, low-life still somehow makes it cyberpunk. No, not really. And putting aside that we've noticed that a lot of people who talk about cyberpunk really don't have a proper understanding of it. Not that we're biased or anything with the whole World Cyberpunk Day that we've been involved with, but a lot of people's concept of cyberpunk is both way too specific and way too broad simultaneously, because of the fact that there's this hyper focus on that high tech, low life approach, which can certainly be done, but the reason I wholeheartedly reject it in the case of this is that is putting emphasis on one particular culture or subculture when the broader theme is the mishmash.
Yep. The biggest thing is that that's the too broad part of the understanding of cyberpunk, and then the too narrow part is always like there must be a dystopia. That one's always too specific.
Mm-hmm. which we've talked about in the past. And just because a lot of popular cyberpunk works have done the dystopia does not necessarily mean that that anyone who's writing a cyberpunk story has to do the same thing. And arguing otherwise is an argumentum ad populum, which is a logical fallacy.
Hmm. The but the ultimate point of all of this, I guess, Monk, would be the fact that the changes that were made showed an inherent, like you titled, disunderstanding of the source
Hmm.
and of what makes it unique and what makes it enjoyable.
And I know disunderstanding isn't a word, although I will do my absolute best to try and make it one.
Yeah,
Disunderstanding
worse.
was me combining the words disinformation and understanding, or rather, disinformation and misunderstanding.
Mm.
It is when someone is intentionally choosing not to fully understand something because they have an idea in their head on how something is and want to try and enforce that. Um, there's a two-panel cartoon that I often share regarding the difference between the scientific method and the creationist method. Scientific method is here's the evidence, what can we what where does it lead us? Creationist method is here's the conclusion, what evidence can we find to support it?
Yeah. The comic boils down to here's the evidence, what are our conclusions, and then here's the conclusion, what's our evidence.
Hmm. And I think that some of the people involved who ended up taking over the project after Fumble GDR left had their idea of what it was supposed to be built around that, and the source material became secondary to that idea, which is why you get the invoking of cyberpunk or the invoking of other matters, because the closest thing to a cyberpunk story in Cowboy Bebop, as far as I'm aware, would maybe be Brain Scratch. And Brain Scratch was less about cyberspace and more about cults. It was blatantly taking a shot at the Heaven's Gate cult.
Yep.
Like it wasn't even being subtle about it. And I know some might bring up the fact that there is some form of an internet and Ed's hacking skills, but that's nowhere near enough to qualify.
If Ed's hacking skills and the existence of an internet is enough to call something cyberpunk, then the 1995 movie starring a very young Angelina Jolie and a very young Matthew Lillard as hackers hacking against a corporation, the name of that movie being Hackers, is a cyberpunk movie.
Hmm.
You realize how uselessly broad the definition is now when under that particular lens, people?
And I know because of my comments on JRPGs, I've had some people go, "Why do you make such a big deal about definition?" Because with definition comes understanding of pattern, and with understanding of pattern is is naturally understanding how things work and how things don't work. It is key to understanding. Like if somebody's going to talk about something within a given genre, then the way that genre should be working should be relatively consistent. If I say that a certain movie is a summer action movie, you should be able to conjure up a reasonable idea in your head about some of the highlights of that kind of movie.
Mm-hmm.
And this is how it generally works when it comes to things like film, music, and whatnot. I don't think that games, whether it be video games or tabletop games or any sort of enthusiast culture like that, is deserving of a special exception just because of convenience. Now, originally I had thought of, well, how, well, if that's an issue, how would you address it? And truth be told, there's already plenty of games that are doing what Cowboy Bebop was doing in all but name. Uh, Obviously, if it were up to me, I'd just say do whatever the original plan was and stick to that instead of trying to second guess it because it's something different than what you had expected. Which, if you didn't want something different, why'd you hire them? But I would honestly, if somebody wants an equivalent, I would honestly say look at the Firefly RPG by Margaret Weiss Studios.
Mm.
Especially since Firefly even though it leans much more heavily into the Western aspect than Bebop did, it does have that same feel of cultural mixing.
Mm.
Especially with how everybody speaks some level of Chinese, because according to Joss Whedon, when he was developing, he had the idea he had was that the U.S. and China would be the first in the space colonization race, and decades and centuries after that, the cultures intermixed. So you'd have plenty of people who speak English and Chinese fairly regularly. I'd also imagine that he did it as a way to creatively get around swearing,
Hmm.
because Lord knows that's what we would do. Is it because well, in that case, it would only places where that's the native language would get mad about it, and they wouldn't be the primary audience. So,
That's true.
uh, the worst they do is just censor it and then get laughed at by everybody else. But I think that one of the there was a game years ago called Bounty Head Bebop that was heavily drawing notes from both Cowboy Bebop and Outlaw Star, and the fact that the two are in the same conversation so often is not too surprising because they are. I won't say it's a one-to-one similarity, but they do have a lot of thematic overlap. It doesn't exactly help that both of them were produced by Sunrise, and thus carry with it Sunrise's emphasis on technical design,
Mhm.
which I think Sunrise has had that kind of thing since, well, the mid '70s.
I think so.
Uh, like some I mentioned this before, but something that I've always enjoyed with Sunrise's work is the emphasis on all the moving parts whenever they have any sort of machinery.
Yeah.
Now, I suppose games like Savage Worlds could also work. I do remember one person trying to argue that Traveler could work, and I'm like, no, Traveler is much too hard SF for this, and Traveler is doing a lot more planets than just the solar system. And even with that solar system that Bebop has, I don't think they've ventured all the way out to Pluto. I think the
I think Bebop goes as far as Jupiter.
Yeah, Jupiter's moons is the furthest that it goes. I've always had it in my head that there were plans to go further, but because of the gate incident, that didn't happen.
Yeah. A
Oh.
lot of shit has happened in the solar system to make people fearful of going further.
Hmm. There's also the fact that even though the so many of the asteroids have been colonized, they're not exactly in the best shape.
I
It's still
mean,
still livable, but just remember that one of them was TJ.
yeah. Well, I was gonna say the asteroids remind me of some very, very hard settlers during the settling period in harsh places.
Hmm. And
Homesteaders.
yeah, the thing the thing is that it's important. Even if something like Bebop leans heavily into science fiction, it's as much of a mishmash as the people within it. And somebody who wants to design a Bebop RPG has to have an understanding of that. You can't put it as strictly cyberpunk or as strictly space opera or whatnot. It's a mix, much in the same way that Final Fantasy has always been a mix of different fantasy genres and subgenres from day one. This sort of mixing is something that you're going to see quite a lot in in popular culture in Asia.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, we see we've talked about this before, but I always come back to the fact that there are full-on science fiction settings that are still wuxia or cultivation settings or cultivation stories, I should say.
I could go on for hours about quite a few different stories I've read or am reading where yes, it's a cultivation story with a bunch of sci-fi.
Hmm. And because the big reason why that is important is when we look at a lot of conversations regarding genre here in the West, there is this debate there's a debate with some games or some series on whether they count as science fiction or fantasy, that those are hard lines and you're not supposed to cross them until it's convenient, but we're not having that conversation. And then there's the debate about whether or not, say, John Carter counts as a sci-fi story or a fantasy story.
The answer is yes.
Hmm. Obviously, with or whether certain superheroes lean more into that, and once again, the answer is yes, because it's more about whatever the writers at the time want to go in. If they want to have Batman working with aliens, then that's going to happen.
And we have in fact seen Batman work with aliens.
Hmm. Even though one of those instances was the brief time that he had a Green Lantern ring that only lasted about 5 minutes, because the Guardians realized what a horrible mistake that was.
And then he got a yellow ring right after.
Hmm. That also didn't last.
Although he did manage to. Which lantern was it at that time? Was that still Hal at the time? Um, he managed to go. He managed to talk about how his yellow ring um, could still affect Green Lanterns, even though the yellow weakness had been taken out of the main battery on Oa.
Hmm.
And Hal asked how, and well, everyone knows Batman doesn't tell people that shit.
But the point this is something that has to be addressed. And I'm not saying that I have the 100% perfect answer, because obviously I don't. But I think a lot of people will approach something like Bebop or other manga and not and try and put a square peg in a round hole, because they're still using that understanding of genre as this hard line. And despite what I said about genre earlier, I don't subscribe to that hard line approach. The approach that I always say is it's an umbrella. An umbrella,
Mm-hmm.
and despite that being a very wide umbrella at times, there are still certain pillars under that umbrella that are going to be more reliable, just with a lot of wiggle room elsewhere. Oh. Consider that Star Trek and Babylon 5 are both in the same genre of science fiction leaning on space opera. But even with that, there are significant differences between the two. B5 has a much greater emphasis on mythology than Star Trek does, for instance. DS9 is the closest that it comes to flirting with that, but that's a whole other kettle of fish.
Mm-hmm.
But it is one of them is more about a future optimism. The other one is more about the new establishing a neutral ground and the difficulties of that with all of the different factions involved.
Yeah.
And I'm well aware that that is not the full thing, that is not the full Monty, as it were. But I'm trying to summarize it so I don't go down too far of a rabbit hole.
Yeah, let's not get into the minutiae of either of the shows because that would take forever.
Mm-hmm. And fortunately, because of the fact that the Hexis system is under a Creative Commons license, there would be little stopping me if I were to write a Cowboy Bebop RPG in all but name. I don't have any plans to anytime in the future because I haven't figured out the angle to do it, and I don't want to just copy pasta what Claudio had put up in that initial playtest. But there's very little that's stopping me from trying. What I do So because of that, I'd like to veer into the other end of the spectrum when it came to this episode, and that is going into the various stories that Cowboy Bebop had, and I'm ignoring the manga because that was one of those manga after the fact instead of being the source material. And
the source material is the show.
Mm-hmm. And examine which stories based on some of the premise aspects would be good to explore. But there is one bit of advice I would give people if they want to try and do a Bebop RPG. Ensure that every player character has some level of baggage. Some level of baggage, and more importantly, some sort of secret that could come back to haunt them.
Even Ed had that.
Yeah, I believe in Ed's case that secret was her being from not her being from Earth per se, but the whole thing with her father.
Mm.
In obviously looking at the cast, Spike has his whole relationship with Julia and his status as a former. I think he was a sweeper for the Red Dragons. But the bigger thing is just the relationship between Vicious and Julia and how that fell out.
Yeah.
Obviously with Jet, it has to do with not only his relationships but his falling out from the ISSP.
Because he couldn't get the type of justice that people deserved because of their connections.
Mm-hmm. With Faye, it mostly has to do with her missing memories.
Yep.
I guess the only exception would be Ein because well, he's a dog. A very smart dog, but still a dog.
A dog that can counter hack one of the best hackers in Brain Scratch. Remember that.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm go- what I'm going to do for now, given that obviously when drawing upon episodes, drawing upon them one for one is not the point,
Mm.
but more of drawing upon the framing device and how that could work. Obviously, we are not acknowledging the Netflix show because everyone has agreed to collectively never speak of it again. I don't even know how well that comic did that was based on it.
There was a comic based on the Netflix show?
I remember seeing it in my news cycles, and then nobody I knew covered it. But that's as far as it ever went. I get the feeling it was like a one-off because
Very likely.
I get because I guess given how much money they spent on getting the IP, they wanted to try and get as much as possible out of it. Um, you saw a similar thing with Rebel Moon where there was a prequel comic to it. Although,
Mm.
given that they hired the complete wrong person to do that comic, I can understand why that didn't turn out. But even during the time, I saw a couple comments. I saw a couple comments about how it was being developed, and then that was it. So it couldn't have been all that great. That and there was probably a shit rolls downhill kind of thing when the show became so wildly unpopular. In fact, a little bit of behind the scenes, we were actually considering at one point doing a monastic therapy of it, but it was. But you couldn't even get past the second episode before we were like, no, we're not doing it.
I watched episode 1 and episode 2 and decided I would not like to commit suicide.
And obviously, I am morally opposed to torturing non combatants, so. But I suppose the first story to discuss in this would be Asteroid Blues.
Which, let's be fair, Asteroid Blues as an episode really fucking sells Cowboy Bebop.
It does. There's a heavy leaning to taking notes from Desperado. I mean, as
Mm-hmm.
I think Asimov. I can't remember if it was actually confirmed, but I remember hearing that Asimov Solensen was loosely based on Antonio Banderas.
I don't think it was ever officially confirmed, but he definitely has that parallel to the mariachi character from the Desperado movies. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think the first thing to go with when it comes to even if you're just doing bounty of the week kind of stories, is that there's always something more to a given bounty. In the case of Solensen, the big thing was trying to use the massive amount of bloody eye that him and his partner stole to get a better life for themselves on Mars. Oh, which of course where you end up getting that warning from Spike. And as far as how you could integrate that in a tabletop, um, I would say placing an emphasis on the fact that direct confrontation would not be a good idea because of um, the effects of bloody eye.
Yeah, that an indirect approach would be preferable.
Mm-hmm. And of course, what would make things more complicated is that the syndicate wants to get their stuff back since in the episode it was heavily implied that just making a vial is a difficult and time consuming process.
and he had a bunch of it.
Mm-hmm. Uh, so the, so moving so I would I would say there's one concept that's often discussed in film that I think can work just as well in tabletop, and I think it's something we'd explore with this experiment. There's three pillars of a proper plot: goal, stakes, and urgency. Now, with stakes, admittedly that's the one that would be a bit that'd be a bit flexible, since the early stakes is get the bounty, get paid.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the other end of the stakes would be get paid with before the syndicate gets a hold of the guy, because if he's dead, you don't get paid.
Or you get paid very little.
Mm-hmm. Never,
There
never.
was there were some bounties that were accepted dead.
Yeah. Uh, the set. So moving on from that, we have Stray Dog Strut, which the most unsubtle name was Abdul Hakim. Like, you're not even fooling anybody with that.
No, I don't know who that could be at all, Monk.
Mm-hmm.
No idea.
And obviously the big thing to build around with something built on Stray Dog Strut would be chasing. So if you have a game that has decent long form chase mechanics, this would be where you can flex that.
Yeah.
I'm not putting myself on a pedestal, since we have that as one of our options. Uh, then we move into Honky Tonk Woman, and of course the first appearance of Faye. And obviously the big focus with that one is the chip. I almost called it a platinum chip, but it more or less is, since I'd say it's the equivalent of a digital skeleton key.
The game was rigged from the start, Monk.
It's just that instead of being an upgrade for a bunch of killer robots, it is a skeleton key that could unlock just about any security code, but the key is encrypted.
Mm-hmm.
So that because of that, you could get into just about any bank and get Lord knows how much amount of money from that. Pull off the heist of the century with that kind of tech. And I'd say the theme to go around with building around Honky Tonk Woman is more about negotiation,
Yeah, social interaction.
because obviously that particular chip is valuable, but you're dealing with people who aren't exactly going to be the most trustworthy when it comes to getting you your money about it, if you were to sell it off. Um,
Uh, let's just forget the fact that Spike and Jet thought it was worthless and spent it at a different casino. That chip.
yeah, and part of me wonder, given the amount of references throughout the series, part of me wonders if somebody was watching Casino during this.
Wouldn't surprise me.
Uh, and as for, um, when it and next on the list, of course, is Gateway Shuffle. And truth be told, Gateway Shuffle, I don't think there's a whole lot of meat on the bones as far as adapting the tabletop.
Nah.
I mean, maybe doing a chase regarding the gates, but we already covered doing chases when earlier in this. And I'm not saying Gateway Shuffle's a bad episode, but in terms of what you could draw upon it for a TTRPG campaign, it's not a whole lot. Although truth be told, the closest I could probably do is use it to take a giant piss on activist groups.
Yeah, but that's not very interesting as far as gameplay goes.
Yeah, and that's more of a at the table kind of thing.
Yeah. No, but then we get to the best early episode, Ballad of Fallen Angels.
Mm-hmm. Which, if I said that Asteroid Blues was drawing upon Desperado, Ballad of Fallen Angels, and one could argue Spike's character arc in general, is very much drawing upon Hard Boiled.
I would argue that Jet's past draws more on Hard Boiled more, just because of how we see his past portrayed. This is more if I had to liken it to anything, this is Spike going up against his old organization. This is almost Born Identity like, except not spies per se. Just the same concept.
Mm-hmm. But it does dive into one thing that I had hinted at earlier. Every character should have some sort of baggage, and that baggage should be something that the GM can explore and something that the player can invoke at certain points, but not invoke too much. You don't need to bring up every episode that's every session that say Cloud is a member of Soldier, and in the same vein, you don't need to bring up that Spike used to work for the Red Dragon Syndicate.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as introduce it, the thing about introducing some sort of old enemy in that regard, the way Vicious is introduced, that is something that would be a little bit tricky because it's kind of hard to have that same connection to a rival when you have a full table.
Well, that's why it works with, everybody has different backstories and different baggage.
Mm-hmm.
This could be baggage for one character. And, you can always work people's backstories into sessions. That's part of being a good GM.
Yeah. I mean, backstory is character background for a player and character blackmail for a GM. I will admit that I think the reason that it doesn't come up all that often is because a lot of people are still in that murder hobo mindset when it comes to approaching TTRPGs. And if you want to say do a Bebop-like RPG, you can't have that mindset. You're going to have a whole lot of session zero work between the players and the GM regarding the angles that you want to go in.
You have to have that sort of framework in place depending on the game you're playing. A lot of people who have the murder hobo mindset have been playing games that are, for lack of a better term, combat focused. And I say for lack of a better term because
because they think we're still in the 1970s.
Yeah. People will continually say that roleplay in the world's most litigious game is there and you can use it. I'm like, yeah, it is there and you can use it. Nobody does. If a system exists and it doesn't get engaged with, then it's not an engaging system.
Yeah. The reason it isn't used as much is because there isn't anything to support its use. And I know people will say, well, then you should be improvising. I'm like, you should not, as I've said many times, you should not be relying on veterancy as a crutch.
Here's the thing. Roleplay in the most litigious game has no mechanical reward and thus no incentive. The most mechanical reward you usually see is, oh, I'll give you extra XP or I'll give you an extra level or whatever. That's not a lot. In fact, that's really not enough.
I know that some people bitch about the existence of meta-narrative mechanics or whatever the buzzword is this week, but the reason those things are there is to give an incentive for it. Otherwise, if you get the same kind of result when doing an action, whether you're doing a lengthy set of roleplay or just a single sentence, people are going to do the single sentence. They don't have an incentive to do further.
Yeah. Which is why there are plenty of games out there while they don't give the strongest incentive for narratives, they'll have a common thing about, hey, GM, if your characters choose to engage in roleplay here, maybe give them some advantages or even let them resolve the situation without the need for a roll or whatever other randomization mechanic may exist within the game.
Mm-hmm.
And while that's in my opinion, very weak incentive, it is still better than, oh, just reward gameplay with more advancement. It's more interesting than number go up at the very least. But some of the best games we've reviewed on Valley have a narrative incentive for you to use your roleplay chops while at the same time executing mechanics that are solely for narrative purpose. And in this case, with Ballad of Fallen Angels, the narrative incentive here is a chance for, if Spike is a character sheet, Spike to resolve some of his past baggage, which could be part of approaching how a bounty hunter ends their career. Because as we know from watching Cowboy Bebop, and this is another part that I would say has to be important to any Cowboy Bebop game, you can't be a bounty hunter forever. Either one day you're going to break down and have to stop, your past is going to catch up to you and kill you, or you resolve the past and find freedom in the future. And we have examples of all of this amongst the crew. Ed is definitely the example of resolving the past and looking to the future. Jet and Faye, I would argue to greater and lesser extents, are the people who they just can't do it anymore. And of course, everybody's watched Real Folk Blues Part 1 and 2.
We will get to that in this discussion. But that is why the Hexus system was a natural choice, in my opinion, because facing the end is a central pillar of the game's mechanics.
Exactly.
I would say that being an optional thing works significantly better than some games that have it where it's part of some countdown like effect. And yes, I'm using this to to pick on the whole cyberpsychosis thing in Cyberpunk, or a lot of other games where there's some sort of countdown that if it goes to 0, you lose your character. Those have their place, but the problem is that it's not exactly voluntary. This is why we spoke so highly of raising the death flag in Heavens and Heresies.
because it gives you both a narrative and mechanical incentive to actually do it. Raising the death flag while it results in your character permanently dying is also a way to go out in a blaze of fucking glory and be the goddamn hero of the hour. And I see Porkchop left a couple of comments here. Yes, when we're talking about Bebop and Tabletop, we are not talking about people running around as the cast of Bebop, but rather running around in the world. You weren't here earlier at the beginning of the show. We did mention that already, but I would like to clarify that for you. And regarding incentives for narrative work, just giving loot or giving monetary value is often not enough, because people not role-playing and instead just rolling dice or drawing cards or doing the randomization mechanics to resolve any issues still gives its own set of rewards. And if it's faster and easier to them, they will do that instead. There needs to be an actual incentive that can't be, in my opinion, the best ones are the ones that give incentives that can't be given in any other fashion. Raising the death flag is a good one. That gives that incentive to use that narrative and to use those narrative type skills, because there's something you get from it that cannot be gained in any other way. I might have read that wrong. I will admit that perfectly. My brain has been a pile of mud for most of the day, so please do correct me.
But loot is not is in my opinion, it is one way to do it, but I think the idea of loot, even loot as XP, is overvalued in terms of it being a way to do it. And I often have to wonder when it comes to an emphasis on that, if that's a consequence of what people have as their foundation. If your foundation is that whole adventuring and dungeon crawling stuff, he's saying incentives to find the RPG. It can, especially, and it ties into what Coster said about where the fun comes from in games. But the thing is that he never said what form that reward should take, just that they are being sufficiently rewarded. And much like what I said in my brief cameo in Alistair's video recently on the Monsterverse, there's a matching degree that needs to be accounted for. If you have a setup, if the payoff does not match the value of the setup, that's a net negative. If you're going to have a big setup, you need to have a big payoff. This is why people clown on the infamous Gynax ending, because Gynax has a habit of doing all that build up for an ending that doesn't match.
I mean, really depends on the show for Gynax.
It does, but I'm going into why Gynax ending became something of a running gag.
Yeah.
But I would say that if there's one thing to really take away from an episode like Ballad of Fallen Angels, it is staging.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously the big one is, of course, the entirety of the church scene.
Mm-hmm. Cress, we already mentioned that.
Mm-hmm.
I watched 2 of 8 episodes. No, I am not going to commit mental suicide.
Yeah.
But with Ballad of Fallen Angels, like you said, staging and like I said, this is also one of those chances to resolve a character's baggage.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that should really be something that should be involved in a game like this.
Yeah.
I'm not sure we should go through every episode, Monk, though. I think we should skip to some of the bigger ones.
Yeah, I will. I will note there's not a whole lot that we could get out of um, sympathy for the devil. The only thing I'd note is that I do suspect that the kid in that episode was somewhat inspired by The Omen.
Might be.
Uh, with Heavy Metal Queen, again, that's one that the big thing to get out of it is just exploring a different subculture. In this case, the culture around truckers.
Well, and then the big thing is they have that big ass chase.
Mm-hmm.
We've had some chases already, so
Yeah. Um, with Waltz for Venus, I'd actually say that's a story that is more suited for when characters are, for lack of a better term, high level, and dealing with somebody who's in the same umbrella, but is far more of a rookie and is now over their head on it. Since in that episode, Spike took kind of a mentor role, so I think drawing upon Waltz for Venus, you'd want to lean into that.
this is also another thing I'd like to say is this is also an episode where people could gain baggage.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that Spike definitely gained baggage after Rocco was killed.
Yeah. But then there was jamming with Edward.
This could be done as a whodunit, since everything was being, blamed on Edward, but it wasn't actually Edward doing it.
Mm-hmm. I'd say the big thing is don't reveal who. Build up Edward or your equivalent through reputation, and then subvert it by their actual appearance.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Cress said that they only got into the first episode of Bopflix and then dropped it.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to watch the whole thing so we could have an episode of monastic therapy about it. After 2 episodes, I said no because that's mental suicide. But returning to point, yeah, build up the obvious hacker and make it obvious that this must be the person or whoever they are, and then you could actually have them be the person, or depending on how it goes, you could have it be someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Like make it a whodunit that's actually a whodunit. Hell, randomize it if you have to,
but
always build up the obvious person.
The thing about a proper whodunit is the fact that when it's revealed, the evidence, the clues should always fall into place. When I did that long ass whodunit with the Enemy Within, as far as its 3rd edition version, there were 3 major culprits as far as who was the Black Cowl. All 3 of them had both means, motive, and opportunity. Plausibly speaking, any one of them could have been the one to be the villain in that story. Since every one of them had some degree of baggage that would lean towards that. And some people got it right, some people didn't. I knew who it was going to be from the start, but I didn't say that until I needed to. And some people will have an idea of what it's supposed to be in their head. I see Brian saying, but was it the butler? Actually, Clue would be a good clue. If you want to look at randomizing a whodunit, Clue is a good thing to research. I know some would say that researching social deduction games would be a good case. I don't quite see it, since with social deduction games it is so heavily dependent on the people playing. this is why I would reject wholesale anyone saying that you should look at Among Us to take notes from. So don't get me wrong. I love I love all the shouting and all the stupidity that happens with Among Us, but I'm not sure if I'd use that as research material.
Mm-hmm.
But now, as far as Ganymede Elegy, that is one of those exploring baggage kind of stories. In
Yep.
this case with Jet.
Yep.
Um, I would say the big thing to take away from the fact is that the target that is key to getting the reward and the baggage are linked.
They're not necessarily one and the same, as after all, back in Jupiter Jet, or not, excuse me, I'm stepping ahead. Back in Ballad of Fallen Angels, the bounty was the old capo for the Red Dragon Syndicate, but the connection was Vicious. But that was connected to Vicious.
Mm-hmm. And as far as the
I
next one,
don't think.
Toys in the Attic was a beach episode, which
No, Monk. It was a horror episode. Come on now.
a horror episode disguised as one. The whole thing is, first off, Toys in the Attic was fucking weird. Second off, I could see the horror aspect, and if I draw any comparison, it'd probably be a less serious version of The Thing, or even Outbreak.
Yep. I mean, what the remember that this whole thing ends as a comedy as well. It's a comedy of errors the entire time. First Jet gets bitten, then Faye, and then Spike goes around with a flamethrower trying to kill the thing, and the thing is thwarted in the end by a sleeping Edward eating it.
That and the whole thing started because Spike had found a Ganymede rock lobster, didn't want anyone else getting it, and hid it in a fridge way in the back.
And forgot about it.
Yeah. And when he opened up that fridge, he saw something. He saw something that was so bad he had the whole thing jettisoned. I think we've all had that moment where something was left in the fridge too long, and then you pull it out, and it's some unholy monstrosity.
Mm-hmm.
But when I say beach episode, obviously I don't mean literal beach, but it's beach episodes in anime are usually some sort of cool down episode just before things get serious.
Mm-hmm.
No, a way to kind of set the board before you flip it.
Yeah.
And that's why I call Toys in the Attic a beach episode, because right after that is Jupiter Jazz.
The halfway mark.
Mm-hmm.
And one where shit goes fucked.
Mm-hmm. And again, this is where you can this is another case of exploring baggage, but this time in a way that um in a way that how can I put this, that ends up dragging everyone else involved.
Yep.
Uh, and the I'd say the I'd say the oh, I'm trying to think if there's any other specifics to draw from, and there's not a whole, even with the stuff with Callisto, that's not enough to go any further than what I mentioned about baggage. Um,
I think the big one here is that things like Jupiter Jazz and the later Real Folk Blues episodes are ensemble high notes. Their climax is not just for a single person, but for the entire ensemble cast. This is this is the encore for our impromptu jazz session, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, the baggage drags people in, but it also is a conflict for everybody rather than just one person. So if you do decide to use episodes like Jupiter Jazz Part 1 and Part 2 or Real Folk Blues Part 1 and Part 2, you want to use it as, in my opinion, the high point to an overarching plot that you've been going through.
Mm-hmm.
Things that you may have hinted at in individual sessions, because not every session is going to connect to each other. Certainly didn't in Cowboy Bebop.
I would advise taking a tiers and tentpoles approach.
Yep.
Having your one-offs, but in between more significant affairs.
Yeah. And in the end, these are going to be those big punchy moments to end an arc or to start a new one.
Mm-hmm.
It could be both, because Jupiter Jazz certainly started the entire second half.
Yeah, and I know some might say that in doing this, it's not full freeform role play or something like that, and I want to make something clear. I'm not saying that in any of these that you're using a full script, but rather using bullet points and then exploring how those go from there. But there does have to be a degree of direction. If I'm running something like this, I'm making it explicitly clear right out of the gate, this is not a hex crawl. I don't have anything against hex crawls, it's just that in this kind of situation, that's not what I'd be running.
Yeah, Cowboy Bebop would not be a game. It would not fit any sort of hex crawl. Cowboy Bebop has too much baggage for that. Actually,
it's too civilized, honestly. There's not a whole lot of places in the solar system where you could do that whole West Marches kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe some parts of like Europa or something, but say Mars, absolutely not. Earth, maybe, but nobody goes to Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as the asteroids, again, they're, as weird as it is to say, they're too civilized. And
mission of the week could be one thing, Pork Chop, but the big thing there is that, yeah, you can do a bunch of disparate missions, but leave little hints here and there for the bigger parts.
Mm-hmm.
Tiers and tentpoles is the reference Monk constantly makes regarding this sort of build, because it comes from how the Gargoyles cartoon was produced so that you could basically watch the episodes in almost any order and still get the main plot.
Yeah. Now after that was Bohemian Rhapsody, which I'd say I look at how one would take from Bohemian Rhapsody as a large protracted puzzle. Especially since each of the bounties that they end up getting are tied to the whole chess pieces and the whole thing with Hex. And Ed play. Obviously, you have these. You have the whole pulling the rug in the sense that the plan that Hex had put up was something that he had put in decades in advance, and he got so old he doesn't even remember the plan.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been plenty of those kind of cases where where a request is put in, but it's revealed that the person who had done it had set this up long in advance and is already either alive but is far gone or just dead. I mean, if you look at, say, Near Automata, you had that whole reveal with the aliens, and moreover, the fact that the aliens have been dead for centuries.
And then you get the same reveal on the Yorha side
Mm-hmm.
that the humans have been dead for centuries,
Yep.
millennia even.
Mm-hmm. But see, after that was My Funny Valentine.
This is another episode about baggage and the shedding thereof.
Yeah, it's just
Because
that in this case, the tricky thing is how you do a framing device that is essentially a a flashback, and how you do that with the party involved.
um, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily do that. Um, Mostly because of the fact that, like, you briefly go, you briefly have whoever is playing the character that is supposed to represent Faye in this particular example, uh, convey, hey, yeah, that person that you just captured, Jet, I was the person who woke me up from cryo freeze and told me I had a debt and everything. You know what's really funny? This entire episode should have convinced Faye that she has no debts to pay.
Pretty much. And yeah, that is one of the unfortunate holes. But I see Brian saying Bebop doesn't sound like an exploration; it sounds like episodic shenanigans. Then toss in side events that are relevant to the party. What's saying you can't do both? In fact, if anything, doing both, um, doing both events that are relevant and episodic shenanigans.
You can throw in the relevancy and the exploration as little things here and there, as hints, as small steps towards the bigger whole,
Mm-hmm.
all within something that is episodic shenanigans. That's what Bebop actually did as an anime.
Yeah, and the next one, Black Dog Serenade. This is with a lot of the episodes that focus on Jet, it is heavily leaning into film noir.
Yeah.
And oh, go ahead.
I would argue that with the set of episodes that we're coming up on in the episode list, a lot of these are something taking second fiddle to more resolving the past.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is all on the headlong rush towards the finale.
Yeah, and I'd say the big thing in this was establishing that when Jet was part of the ISSP, he was gung ho, which first off ruffled some feathers, and second off is what gave him that nickname, the Black Dog.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that it's in a lot of detective fiction, you have that line between someone who's an idealist regarding a vision of justice or what they're supposed to be doing as an officer, and the more cynical side.
The quote unquote realists, as they would call themselves.
Mm-hmm. And a conflict about who has the right attitude. Usually, with the idealist getting something of a dressing down, but not really dropping their idealism.
Yeah.
And as hard to believe as it may sound, Jet is in that kind of setup, because he could have just as easily just accepted the way things were and kept at his job, but instead he quit and became a bounty hunter.
Because he felt it was more direct. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Granted, he's had plenty of problems on that, especially given who he associates with. But he's kind of put himself in the dad position for the whole team.
I mean, bell peppers and beef, Monk.
Mm-hmm.
Without the beef.
Yeah.
But like I said, a lot of this is things now taking second fiddle to the resolutions of the past baggage.
Mm-hmm.
Because Black Dog Serenade does have some, like you said, film noir to it, and it also has kind of a partial whodunit in it because of what he finds out about his old partner.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a repeating thing when it comes to the relationships that Jet has, and I'd say anybody taking from that, ensure that if there's some sort of breakdown in a past relationship, that it's that the reason for that breakdown is strong enough that they can't be called out.
Yeah.
When it came to his girlfriend, it was the fact that he was making decisions for both of them, and even though he was always right, she couldn't accept it.
Yeah.
Neither side was wrong in their in their attitudes from their perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But neither was more right than the other either, is the key thing.
Yeah.
As far as Mushroom Samba, the main thing to take out of that, going down the list, is just to do one giant trip.
I'm going to argue that this is again one of those episodes you can't really take much from, kind of like Toys in the Attic and Sympathy for the Devil, or not Sympathy for the Devil. Yeah, Sympathy for the Devil.
Mm-hmm.
And Gateway Shuffle. Mushroom Samba, much like those ones, is a moment of calm before another storm starts.
Yeah. Although if I was running it at a physical table, just as a gag, I'd probably replace all of the usual snacks with various forms of shiitake.
Of course you would.
Instead of a bowl of some sort of chips with some towels, I'd probably have a bowl full of sliced shiitake mushrooms.
Mm-hmm. And going forward in many of these next episodes, Speak Like a Child is resolutions for Faye. Mm-hmm. Wild Horses is technically more resolutions for Spike. But these are both passive episodes, extremely passive, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they'd make for good TTRPG fodder.
Yeah.
Whereas we get to Pierre LaFaux.
This is the one where I won't argue about being horror.
Yes, absolutely. It's a horror game, and there's just a lot of stuff here that you could take for this to make it to ratchet up the horror, especially considering how mundane Pierre LaFaux really is. Mad Pierrot himself.
Mm-hmm. I would advise juxtaposing that level of horror with the amount of brightness, like the whole theme park thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
I mean, why else is the amusement park one of people's favorite levels in Nier Automata? Because it's so fucking there is that just juxtaposition between how cheery an amusement park is supposed to be, and then the fucking beautiful robot fight.
And I know some might say, wouldn't Five Nights at Freddy's lean into that? No.
Five Nights at Freddy's was never a good horror game.
And narratively, it's not a very strong. It doesn't do a strong enough job at the switch regarding the animatronics not being what they're supposed to be.
Yeah. No knocking on Scott Cawthon. He did
Mhm.
great with what he had, and I'm glad that he found success.
Yeah.
But after Pierre LaFaux, we have Boogie Woogie Feng Shui.
Which I would say is I would say that is more of a to a certain extent it is a baggage story, but moreover it's a protracted chase.
It's not just a protracted trace; it's actually a treasure hunt.
Yeah.
It's a treasure hunt with a time limit, I guess is the best way to put it.
And this is me at the risk of sounding too Minnesotan. The main thing that I'd use as a parallel is the medallion hunt. You've lived in Minnesota long enough. You should know about the medallion hunt with the Winter Carnival.
Pain, Pecco.
For those
Pain, Pecco.
for those who are not as blessed to be in in the best state in the Midwest, every year there's the Winter Carnival. Which was done over 100 years ago out of spite because a New York reporter thought in the late 19th century thought that Minnesota was uninhabitable because he couldn't handle the winter. Skill issue. And the carnival was made to as one giant fuck you, and it evolved and eventually got its own lore, its own royal family, and sometimes the Ice Palace. But there is a medallion that's hidden somewhere in the Twin Cities, and every day in the Star Tribune, which is one of the two major newspapers in the Twin Cities, and the only one of the two that focuses on the Twin Cities as a whole instead of just St. Paul, which is what the Pioneer Press does. There's a clue in that. And the first person to find where that medallion is hidden gets a cash prize. I think it was like $1,000, which certainly a lot for a medallion, but it's finding one medallion in the entirety of the Twin Cities. I'm not going to say Twin Cities is New York big, but it's no slouch either. But I think that since it's building on a treasure hunt, building it around where the next clue is something to work with. And there is one film franchise that did just that you could take notes from as well, in the same vein.
Mm-hmm.
National Treasure.
Mm-hmm.
More the first than the second would fit in this instance. I know that there was that series on Disney Plus. We don't talk about it because it's a Disney Plus series for something that didn't really need a follow-up. But the next one on the list, Cowboy Funk. I'm not entirely. I know that this was used as the basis for the example module in the playtest that we covered.
Mm-hmm.
But let's be honest, Cowboy Funk was all about how far you can stretch one gag.
Yeah. It was another episode of catharsis before getting back into something very heavy with the aforementioned Brain Scratch.
Mm-hmm.
Brain Scratch would be another horror episode or another horror game in my mind.
Just more psychological than the monster type horror that you had with Pierre LaFaux.
Yeah. And then we get to this is my example of the conclusions that a bounty hunter could come to. This is the bounty hunter has moved on from the past and is seeking a new future with Hard Luck Woman.
Mm-hmm.
Because the whole point of Hard Luck Woman is Ed makes a fake bounty so that the Bebop crew can lead her to her father. And her father just says, "Oh, cool. and then just goes back to doing his work as a cartographer on Earth. And at the end of the day, Ed and Ein leave the Bebop to go search for her father. This is Ed leaving behind all of the past karma she has with the crew, all the hacking she's done, and deciding to search for a future for her father. Because she didn't really have the baggage with her father because she never had a father. The baggage is the lack of a father. By letting that baggage go, she can go and have a relationship with him now. And to be honest, Ed is the only member of the Bebop crew who gets a happy ending.
Mm-hmm.
I'm once again reminded why I only rewatch Cowboy Bebop sparingly, because goddamn, I do not need that heartache.
Yeah. Before we dive into the real folk blues, I think we should at least take a gander when it came to Knocking on Heaven's Door. There's much that we could draw from when it comes to that.
I think Knocking on Heaven's Door is an extended. It's a multi-session thing, because Knocking on Heaven's Door is, well, a feature-length film rather than an episode.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this would be like a multi-session continuation, with each session being, this would be a classic three act structure.
Would you, in that regard, would you stretch each act as its own session?
Well, when we look at the actual movie itself, it is. Like, the preamble is, hey, guy has this this stuff that's going to kill a lot of people by infecting them with the same nanomachines he has.
Mm-hmm.
And they have to find him. The first part is, the first part as the setup,
Mm-hmm.
is that there's let me think of the setup here. Faye encounters someone while she was going after a different bounty, and the bounty's vehicle explodes, and the other guy jumps off the bridge just fine.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a virus spread from the tanker, and that the big setup is encounter, and then them going and looking for information, all of them looking in different places.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And I could certainly see that, and obviously the second one is figuring out what exactly is what they thought was a virus.
Mm-hmm.
If you want the urgency, it's the fact that a pharmaceutical company is also looking into it, though not for the best of reasons. And the stakes are simply the fact that Vincent plans on expanding this particular experiment.
There goes the monk's microphone, everybody. This sometimes happens.
Oh, god damn
Technology, it likes to give us the middle finger. Hopefully he will return shortly.
Yo.
There you go. You're back, monk.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and the other part of this second part is going to be like the initial fights with Vincent, because they fight and always lose him, like on the monorail system and stuff. Whereas the final session would be the climax. Both the the part of the mission where they have to get the climate control center raining so that the vaccine can go out to the whole colony, and the part where they apprehend Vincent or attempt to.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be 3 different sessions, and each is going to be a different play style.
I think
Like the first,
I think the tricky part would be how you have the players lose without it feeling like they just got TPK'd or wiped.
do it the same way the show did. If you or rather do it in a way that if they lose, they also lose some time. So things there's a little more pressure, a little more little more that they have to deal with in the next session. But if it's like the part where they fight on the monorail and they lose Vincent, it's just, hey, you fought to the best of your abilities, and this guy just had an escape plan. And so he uses his escape plan instead of beating you down.
Mm-hmm.
Because ultimately, there is always going to be a sense of risk. And the part if you lose big time on the third act, all of a sudden all these people have this nanomachine in them, and this colony is probably going to die soon. Oops.
Mm-hmm.
But you could have normal successes, just get them through the normal way. A greater amount of success make it a little bit easier for them in the future. And failure makes it harder for them in the future.
Mm-hmm.
But that's how I would probably deal with that.
Yeah, I could see it.
But
now,
with that, we come to the ending for the rest of the Bebop crew.
mm-hmm.
The Real Folk Blues, Part 1 and Part 2. And honestly, this is a case of Faye has mostly dealt with her baggage, and Jet has mostly dealt with his. This is a case of they're getting ready to leave all their baggage behind. So much so that, well, we'll get to that. So much so that they're trying to convince Spike to also leave the baggage behind.
Although,
and
if I recall how it was set up, he might have been willing to do it, but the baggage hasn't left him.
Yes, because there's a brief point where Faye helps Julia get away from the Red Dragon, and even tells Spike where Julia is, and that's where Spike goes. But then when Faye goes back to the Bebop, a bunch of Red Dragons hit the Bebop.
What I was referring to is the fact that the whole reason Spike gets dragged into this whole thing is Vicious tried a coup d'état on the elders of the Red Dragon Syndicate, and it ended up backfiring. And because of how they operate, they want Vicious dealt with, and anybody he was ever associated with wiped out.
Well, but Vicious does eventually take over the Red Dragon Syndicate. He did kill the elders.
Mm-hmm.
Because the big thing that happens is Faye helps Julia get away from the Red Dragon hit squads, and helps Spike reunite with Julia. Whereas, and then Faye goes back to the Bebop, because that is her trying to help Spike dump his baggage and start a new life. And then she's going to go back to the Bebop, help out Jet, and dump her own baggage and start a new life there.
Mm-hmm.
But the hit squads follow her back, and they fuck up the Bebop, and they fuck up, well, sort of, Jet and Faye. Which does get back to Spike and Julia.
Mm-hmm.
But the big thing that gets the final part, Vicious has finally taken over the Red Dragon Syndicate. Spike and Julia are just going to run away and disappear. But the Red Dragon won't leave him alone. And because of his whole I'm kind of hallucinating the past in my robot eye thing, because he said one eye always sees yesterday when talking about his cybernetic eye. He still has this burning desire for vengeance in him. And because he's torn between the two, the Red Dragon Syndicate catches up to them and Julia dies. That is not the way you lose baggage. That is the way your baggage becomes insurmountable. Because when Julia dies, Spike goes back to the Bebop, starts loading up the Swordfish 2 and himself with all of the gear he can. And even Faye tries to talk him out of it. And she's crying by the end of it. And because literally everybody on the ship, Jet, Faye, and Spike, know that what Spike is about to do is suicidal. Spike doesn't think he has anything left to live for. Julia's dead. There's nobody left to him from the past, and he has nobody in the present, or at least that's how he feels. Which, that's a bit shitty on Spike's part, especially with how Jet and Faye have actually grown attached to him. But then, we have that awesome fucking combat scene in the Red Dragon Syndicate building, especially between Vicious and
I'd actually say that scene is a classic case of what we're talking about when it came to the whole raising the death flag thing.
Absolutely. This whole sequence is just him raising the death flag, especially when his cybernetic eye gets shot out. That eye gets shot out for the second time in his life. It's a callback all the way back to his original flashback about when he lost the eye in the first place, fighting side by side with Vicious. It's a juxtaposition to show now that Vicious has dealt the same wound to him that he took in Vicious's place so long ago. And ultimately, he does kill Vicious and a bunch of people in the Red Dragon Syndicate building. And when he comes out and falls down the stairs and ends with bang, that is the worst ending for the bounty hunter. The past catches up and kills you.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, you're going to carry that weight. And then, of course, the middle ending is the ending left to Faye and Jet. They let go of a lot of their baggage. Spike just gave them a whole fuck ton more. And they're getting too tired to do this shit. They've seen too much. Too much has happened to people they care about. I mean, we still have the images during that last scene of Faye crying in the shower and Jet almost doing all the homebody stuff that he does aboard the Bebop absent-mindedly. They're shells of their former selves. They couldn't save the one person who was still core to things they cared about because he no longer saw it as worthwhile.
And I feel like when it comes to trying to do Bebop in tabletop form, the overall arc is one of a tragedy of someone who was succumbed to their own past.
Yep. And in a game about Bebop, when you're designing your own characters with their own burdens of the past, like I said, there need to be sessions that are confronting that past, seeing whether you can lay the past down or whether you continue to carry it with you, whether you continue to carry that weight. And am I saying mechanically there should be a way to track this to see if there comes a time where you might become overburdened by the past? Maybe. If that mechanically fits the game and is narratively rewarding, I could see that being very cool. But I think that would be more on a table-by-table basis. I do, however, think that much like we have been extolling the virtues of raising the death flag for 3 years now, Monk.
Mm-hmm.
There should be a mechanic in the game that allows a bounty hunter to burn. Let me say this for all of you who love anime. Inochi o moyase. Let your life burn bright.
Mm-hmm.
There should be a mechanic that allows you to burn all your burdens for a mechanical strengthening of some sort, whatever shape that might take. I am not saying that I'm going to give it an exact mechanic, but you take your burdens, you burn them all, you get a mechanical strengthening that allows you to overcome a very, very high crisis at the expense of your life.
Mm-hmm.
That would be equivalent to Spike in Real Folk Blues. That would be absolutely the equivalent. What form that mechanic takes beyond that generalization, no clue. It would really depend on what game was created. But if I had to make some pillars on this game, this hypothetical game we're pitching, one, bounty hunters need to have some sort of burdens from the past, and this needs to be a countable and measurable thing.
To follow up on that, I think that if I was writing this, I would put a lot of emphasis on writing out and detailing various factions and cultures that could be used as fertile ground to create that baggage and give guidance for it.
Yes. On top of that, the mechanics need to allow a way to either resolve burdens or get more burdens, because it is a fluid thing. And part of the goal of the game should be to try and resolve the burdens of your bounty hunter so that they can have a better life. And I think the big one, 3, you need to allow for a multitude of different encounter types, I guess is the best way to put it. Both, we've talked about chases, we've talked about mysteries, we've talked about whodunits, we've talked about treasure hunts, we've talked about horror, we've talked about the good old-fashioned gunfight.
Mm-hmm.
You need to have mechanics allowing for all of these things, and they need to be able to be pretty fluid, because there are missions and sessions where multiple of these things happen, and then I guess big one for, like I said, the system to burn all your burdens to go out in a blaze of glory.
Mm-hmm. And I know that for some who have that wargaming mindset, this might be harder to grasp. And I'm not saying that as a dismissive sense, but there are a large swath of people in the tabletop scene that have that as their default and think that that's what you're supposed to do, just because that's what they've always done. The whole design by gospel thing we've talked about. However, not every setting that is rife with exploration potential is one that really fits that. And I know some of those might say, well, just don't do a Bebop TTRPG. The world of Bebop itself and the intermingling of cultures that it presents, and the presence of counterculture that it presents, is in itself strong enough to handle. It's just one that requires a different approach than that wargaming mindset. And you can't put a round peg in every hole. Some of those holes are going to be square
or triangular.
Mm-hmm. That's just how this kind of thing works. That is not to say that it can't be done, but it requires a different approach for the same reason that if I were adapting if I were making a mecha RPG, I would only use character classes if the setting of that mecha RPG was one that lent itself to it. If I'm just doing a kitchen sink sandbox, I'm not going to do that. mean, granted, I wouldn't do a kitchen sink sandbox with Mecha because that's a wide ass net. I know some people will bring up Super Robot Wars, but even Super Robot Wars has a particular skewing in terms of what series are showcased in it.
Yeah, you barely see Escaflowne in Super Robot Wars.
Now, granted, I haven't played every Super Robot Wars, but I would say the majority of the mechs in that series lean into the science fiction end of the equation.
Mm, more science fantasy than science fiction.
Yeah, which makes something like Escaflowne or Rayearth would be a pick that would be a bit odd to work with.
I mean, they've been using Rare Earth a lot recently, actually.
Okay, I stand corrected on that, but I think you see where I'm going with this.
Yeah,
I'm not saying it's impossible. It would just be tricky.
yeah. It's true that they use a lot more sci-fi, sci-fantasy than they do straight fantasy when it comes to mecha there.
Mm-hmm.
I think Escaflowne's only ever been in 2 games. Ray Earth has been in like 4, I think, at this point. They even did Machine Hero Wataru in 1 game.
Yeah.
But yes, a lot of their mecha skew either sci-fi with earlier Gundam and Nadesco and all that fun stuff, or later sci-fantasy with things like Unicorn. I'm sorry, I don't care what anyone says. That's sci-fantasy because at the end of the fucking books and at the end of the fucking OVA, they travel through time due to Psycho Frame.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point, Banadra almost becomes a god. And I will always meme it like this. Gave up godhood for the Nookie. That is Banadra. But, or, even bigger sci-fantasy is things like Maz and Kaiser and Shin Getter.
Mm-hmm.
It's just... But just like that's a glorious pastiche of things, so too is Cowboy Bebop, and Cowboy Bebop is a pastiche of entirely different themes, but still a pastiche nonetheless.
Yeah, and it's examining the fact that it's a pastiche should be first priority.
Mm-hmm.
Because from that everything else flows out like the roots on a tree.
Yes.
And this is the reason why we were so harsh on the numerous invocations of cyberpunk within the Cowboy Bebop RPG book. Because that cyberpunk just isn't a strong enough presence.
It's barely any presence. I mean, I know we've gone into it before, but many of the themes that are in cyberpunk aren't present in Cowboy Bebop. So, but I hope that what we've talked about today can be inspiration for someone.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to see someone make this, because frankly, I don't think we have it in us to make another RPG anytime soon. Between you and I, Monk.
There's some ideas I've kicked around, but
I'm talking about full scale though. I don't think.
Yeah.
I think we need to take a little bit of a rest from that.
Yeah, and the sole reason I kick around certain ideas is just because, that's just part of my nature.
Yeah. Oh, you and I theory craft all the time.
I'm not going to stop theory crafting, but fortunately there is no shortage of people who've tackled the idea of doing a TTRPG inspired by Cowboy Bebop. They just don't have the license. In fact,
I mean, Bounty Head Bebop is probably the biggest one we've mentioned before.
It was also one of the earliest examples.
Mm-hmm.
That was mid 2000s.
With all of the pros and cons that a mid 2000s game can have.
Mm-hmm. I did appreciate that it was doing an aim low D20 setup. I mean,
they called it I-20, didn't they?
Yeah. But if you've seen me talk about Fading Suns and the like, you know how it's more or less that it just doesn't have the victory point set up.
Yeah.
And of course, systems like Savage Worlds are a natural fit, although the vehicle part might be a little bit tricky. That's another pillar that I think you'd have to address is some of the more memorable scenes are with the dogfights with the swordfish. And
Or the
to
red tail.
or the red tail or the well, I don't think you can do a whole lot of dogfights with
The
jets and
ham
shit.
the hammerhead.
It's not really
Yeah.
that kind of a ship.
Yeah. It's more a towing skiff than anything.
I mean, it certainly fits Jet as a character, but
Yeah.
it is what it is. And the the thing is that have finding a way to have that kind of dogfight in tabletop form is a very tricky affair, and only a handful of people have been able to pull it off. But they have been able to pull it off. If someone wants to try and do that, I will. The first thing I would tell them: under no circumstances use grid combat. You shouldn't be using grid combat for this kind of thing as a whole, but definitely not for that.
Mm-hmm.
And anyone who insists on using grid combat, you have only yourself to blame.
You deserve all of the bullying you're going to get.
And you will get it. But that will do it for this particular episode. We I was gonna say we'll be back next week, but we kind of will, just not in terms of GeekWatch, since the 6th and the 7th are a pay-per-view weekend, because I'm gonna be in a watch party for WrestleMania. Um,
God have mercy on your soul.
yeah, doing this whole 2-day thing. I'd rather do that than have it be this long ass show like it was before they started that.
Well, I mean, more God have mercy on your soul because WWE.
Well, they've been improving since the whole thing happened with Vince getting ousted, but I just want to see if they're actually going to make up for what happened last year.
Okay. Okay.
Um,
Fair.
'Cause I could just as likely say fuck it, but but on Monday, obviously we're starting our next series, and that's going to be something you guys will see in a few weeks when we do the live stream for Parliament of Geeks. Um, Tuesday, Tachyon Blue is going to have me on for his show, where I'll be able to talk about my experiences with GG and how that kind of helped me get out of my shell.
Mhm.
Uh,
Let him know if he needs another person. I'm always up for an interview on that.
yeah, he's writing a book on the whole thing. Um,
I think I've seen that. Yeah.
yeah, and there's been a few folks that you may know who have done it. The angle that I told him that I wanted to focus on is how I leaned far more into the rebuild initiative,
Mm-hmm.
and in fact, when that seemed to be de-emphasized, that's when I got out. Especially since by that time I was doing my own thing by that point.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, on Wednesday, I'll be interviewing Joe Weaver on his on his RPG called Chosen, which is a solo slash co-op affair that is heavily inspired by Bloodborne. And in fact, one of the initial concept arts was very blatant about that.
Wearing your inspirations on your sleeve.
We do encourage it. Uh, and of course, Thursday will be the conclusion of Monarchs and I's look at the Shattered TTRPG, which has been pretty good.
Good.
Um, and on Friday, you and I are continuing our look at Gods of Metal Ragnarok. Now that we got our glorious bit of stupidity regarding the metal gods out of our system.
What are you talking about out of our system? We live and breathe the metal gods, monk.
Fair. I mean, you're an evangelist, and monks have pulled double duty as priests.
And I am, of course, Chaos Incarnate and the Dragon of Metal.
Mm-mm.
People are like, do you mean the material or the music? And my answer is yes.
As it should be. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk, and join the watch.